Sigebert Tarasch was one of the strongest chess players of the 19th century. He probably could have become a world champion, but he was distracted by his career where he was a medical doctor. But today you're going to see a game that he played that features 10 principles that you can take and apply in your own games that are going to make you a better player. Speaking of becoming a better player, my course Breaking 1500 is reopening on October 14th. You can click the link in the description or go to breaking1500.com. But if you're serious about improving quickly, that's probably the best way to do it for anybody who's under 1500. Having said that, let's jump right in to this game and see what these 10 principles are. All right, here we go. D4, D5. By the way, Tarasch is playing as black, and this is game 29 from the Logical Chess series. For those of you who are following along, we see a queen's gambit, and he declines it, doesn't accept it, plays e6, knight c3, knight f6. So there's a lot of pressure on d5. We can see that already. White is attacking, black is defending, and white continues with bishop to g5. Now here, Tarasch plays a very interesting move. Knight b to d7, and I want you to pay close attention to this pawn on d5. In fact, I'm going to flip the board for you. I want you to imagine you're playing this position as white. What do you notice about the d5 square? And this brings us to principle number 1. Hopefully you said the d5 square looks weak because white has 2 attackers, only 2 defenders, but one of them is pinned, which means can't we just take a pawn? Well, this is principle number 1. Don't be greedy for pawns early in the game. This is especially true when you're playing against strong players. Strong players very rarely just blunder pawns. This is actually a famous trap. I think we've actually talked about it in this series already, but if you think that you can take this because of the pin, you're mistaken, because what black is going to do is sacrifice the queen because they have this amazing follow-up move, bishop to b4 check. The king is trapped. You're forced to give back your queen, and when the dust settles, black has 3 pieces. You only have 2, and black has a winning position. Okay, so principle number 1, don't be greedy for those pawns early in the game. Let's go back, and I'll flip it back to black's perspective for the rest of this game. All right, so what actually happened? Well, white was a good player and played the move e3, didn't fall for the trap. Tarasch plays c6 to defend and just really add the support on d5, and at the same time, lets out the queen on this diagonal, and we're going to see why that's important in just a second. Here, white plays the move queen c2, which at first glance, you could argue that they really should be developing the pieces first. But one of the important parts of developing is not only do you want to get your knights and bishops out, you want a castle. And then this brings us to principle number 2, which is you want your rooks to go towards the center. Usually it's the E, D, and C files. Okay, so after you develop the pieces and you castle, the rooks usually need to go here because if you think about it, these are where most of the pawns are going to be pushed forward, the E, D, and C files, and that's where the pawns are probably going to get traded. That's where the files are going to open up. That's where you want your rooks to be. Even if there's not currently an open file, you want to plan ahead and predict where those open files are going to be. That is why the rooks should go here. And one of the things about moving the queen off the back is it allows your rooks free access to get to wherever they need to go. So this is actually not a terrible move. That's part of the idea. So that's principle number 2. Rooks generally go to E, D, and C files after you've completed your other development. All right, so Tarasch plays the move queen a5, and I would like you guys to pause and think through this. What is the threat, or what's one of the things that white needs to be careful of after black plays this move? All right, we had a chance to look at that. Hopefully you noticed the bishop sitting on g5, because the queen is in line with the bishop, and the bishop is undefended, which means if you're white and you play a move like bishop to d3, that's a huge blunder, because now black can simply capture, which attacks the bishop, and at the same time attacks the other bishop. And you have a problem that 2 pieces are undefended or being attacked at the same time. You can't deal with both of them. Even if you try to trade here, the pawn's going to capture, which hits the queen, and you have to really save the queen, and then you lose the bishop anyway. Okay, so very sneaky move, and those are the kind of things that you want to pay attention to. Even though there's not an immediate attack, there could be, and that's where you can get into trouble. All right, so white plays captures to remove the tension there. They don't want to have to worry about that pawn capture that I just mentioned. And so black takes with the knight. Again, what is the threat that black has here? And well, it's the same exact idea as before. We're going to unleash the queen to hit the bishop. The way we're going to do that is by trading and taking this knight. So this is the immediate threat. Take a piece, and when white recaptures, we simply grab the bishop for free. So how does white deal with that? Well, they played knight to f3, which defends the bishop, so it's no longer a liability from the queen. Bishop to b4 pins the knight and really piles on the pressure. Now I have another moment for you guys to pause here. This was not what was played in the game, but I want you to notice there's 1, 2, 3 attackers and only 2 defenders, okay? So what would you have done if white said, well, let me just defend? Because rook c1 could have could have been a possible move here. Now there's 3 defenders to the knight. What move do you play here as black? Well, if you're paying attention, you will notice that the knight is still pinned. The rook is no longer here defending this pawn, which means you can just take the free pawn. It's just a free pawn because the knight can't do anything about it. Okay, so I always want to be paying attention, especially when you have pins. It gets very, very tricky because pieces that normally are doing things are not, and that's an easy one to miss, right? So queen takes a2 would be the move there. Now, I guess white saw that and decided to play a different move, although it's arguably not as good of a move. King to d2. Now, this is usually like a last resort. Okay, you don't want to move your king unless you absolutely have to. Now, white felt like they needed to because otherwise they were just going to lose a pawn. They wanted to hold on to the pawn, so they played king d2, but I really don't love that move. All right, so this brings us to principle number 3, which is if your opponent's king is stuck in the center, you want to open the center as fast as you can. Now, how do we know that our opponent's king is stuck in the center? Well, because they just moved it, right? If you move your king, you can no longer castle, which means, guess what? It's stuck in the center. Now, if the king was just sitting on e1, the bishop gets moved, they're about to castle next move, that's a different story. They're probably not going to stay in the center. They're going to, castle at some point. Not the same situation. But since they've moved the king here, now we know where their king is going to be. So what does Tarrasch do? c5. He immediately starts to put the pressure to open up where the king is. Also, he might use the c file here to attack the queen or put pressure on the knight, but primarily he's kind of paying attention to the king. All right, so white plays the move a3. This pin is just too annoying. He wants to get rid of it, and so he's putting the pressure on the bishop. Now, technically, it is pinned because of the queen, so black doesn't have to react to that right away, but they do go ahead and just trade. Trades here, which further opens up the king, also opens up the c file like we talked about previously. Knight comes over to b6, kind of eyeing these squares. Bishop to d3, bishop to d7, rook to c1. White's bringing over the pieces to defend the weaknesses, and black plays rook c8, followed by castles. Now, when black castles here, this brings us to principle number 4. Make sure your king is safe before you launch an attack. Now, this comes with a warning or a caution or an exception, whatever you want to call it. The exception is this. If your opponent has such a bad position, there's some weakness that is so bad that you have to attack it immediately or they're going to fix it like next move, then that might be a situation where you just got to go for it. You don't have time to castle. You just need to play that move, whatever it might be. This position, that's not the case, okay? The position is not like going to change in one move where the advantage suddenly disappears. So Tarrasch says, you know what? I'm going to take my time. I'm going to get my king to safety first. Then I will kind of launch my attack, okay? But that's the one exception. If your opponent like blunders a fork or a tactic or something, you do need to take advantage of those right away. If not, then it's better to get your king to safety. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So king to e2, basically what white is saying is, look, there's already 3 pieces attacking this and 3 pieces defending, but black's going to be able to go one more, double up the rooks, get another one there with a rook, and he doesn't have his piece set up to defend. This knight can't defend the pawn. The bishop can't defend the pawn. This rook technically could, but you're still going to get into trouble because black's going to have 2 extra pieces that they could add. And so white decides to know, you know what, I'm going to abandon the pawn. Who cares? So he takes it, and he has the option to take with the knight or the queen, and this brings us to principle number 5, which is when you are ahead material, it's good to trade pieces. Now, black is ahead material because this was a free pawn. Okay, he won the pawn, and now that he's won the pawn, he takes with the queen because he's happy if the queens get traded. Okay, at the start of the game, when there's all the pieces on the board, if you're up 1 pawn, it's like, yeah, okay, cool, but it's not that big of a deal. At the end of the game, when there's only a king and a couple pawns left, that 1 extra pawn might be enough to become a queen and just win you the game. So trading when you're ahead material is a good thing. All right, so white says, no thanks, I'll go back here. And what's the threat? That's correct. He is attacking on h7, so make sure you pay attention to that. Tarrasch, of course, notices that and plays h6, which attacks the bishop. Retreats the queen, king goes back, knight jumps into a nice square, bishop goes back, and he plays the move bishop to a4. Now, with bishop to a4, we come to principle number 6. And principle number 6 is this. If you're not sure what to do, make one of your bad pieces better. or make one of your bad pieces good, something like that, right? So basically, if you look at this position, these knights are very powerful. Okay, this is a very nice outpost for this knight. This guy is supported by the queen. They're kind of in enemy territory, attacking a lot of annoying squares, threatening lots of different forks. The knights are very good. The queen is very good. It's controlling the diagonal. It's controlling the file. It's defending here. It's attacking over here. Like, it's doing a lot. The bishop and the rook are kind of like, meh. They're not really great pieces for black. So what does he do over the next couple of moves? He fixes those bad pieces and turns them into better pieces. Okay, and that's what strong players do. They take their bad pieces and they make them good. So bishop to a4. Now it's more aggressive. It's blockading this pawn, so that's stuck, but he's controlling all of these squares. And then the very next move, to deal with the threat on his knight, what do you think he does? Well, this should be pretty easy, right? He takes that rook, which wasn't really doing much, and guess what? Now it's on the open file. It's defending the knight, but it's on the open file. Okay, take your bad pieces, make them good. Let's keep going. Queen to e2, and he starts to kind of jump in with the knights, attacks the queen. The queen doesn't have a lot of places to go, has to go back. He plays knight to a5. He's planning on jumping into b3. And let me see. White plays the move bishop takes h6. Now, before we talk about what happens after bishop takes h6, I want to just pause and ask you the question, what if white would have played bishop to d2? This is a good moment to test yourself, work on your tactics a little bit. What move should you play here as black? If you had a chance to look at that, the move is knight to b3. And this is why he went here, because he wanted to jump in. And the reason that knight b3 is so powerful is that if you look carefully at the rook, it has nowhere to go to, because all these squares are controlled by the knights. Look at this. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. The knights are controlling all those squares. The rook is trapped. And if you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, takes, I lose 2 knights for a rook. I thought that's a bad trade. Watch this. He takes, you don't recapture right away. You trade here first. You're still hitting the rook. And let's just say that they trade and try to move their rook somewhere. Well, where are they going to move to? Because the bishop is also under attack. So they have to move here to defend. But now you have a follow-up move, knight to c1, which unleashes that bishop, hits the rook, hits here at the same time, and you are going to still win material. Okay, so that one was a little bit advanced because you kind of had to see this follow-up knight to c1 idea and notice that the bishop was under attack. So there was a lot going on there, but that was the idea. Okay, so because of that, white was like, no, if that doesn't seem to work out, I'm going to just kind of go a little bit crazy here, try to bust open the king and see what I can do to attack black's king. Principle number 7 is that you don't always have to recapture. You don't always have to recapture. Okay, I think a lot of beginners, I say beginners, but even intermediate or strong players have this instinct of like, if somebody takes a piece, well, I just got to take it. That's the only thing. I have to take it back. And no, you don't. You do not have to take this back. Okay, and that's what Tarrasch does. He plays knight b3 instead. He's like, look, the rook is still trapped. Remember, the rook is still trapped there. I'm just going to go for the rook. He ignores this. It's just a pawn. Doesn't really affect his king too much, so he goes for the rook. Now, you could have taken this. There's nothing wrong with taking the bishop. Your king is a little bit more exposed, but there's no immediate threat from white's pieces, so this was totally fine. But I wanted to point out, a lot of beginners just have that habit of like, it's the only move. I'm like, wait a second, maybe not. That's what we see here. So bishop goes back. I mean, what else is he going to do? At least he got a pawn. He takes the rook, takes here, and bishop to b5. Now, bishop to b5 goes back to principle number 5 that we talked about earlier. When you are ahead material, trading is good, right? And remember, black is ahead material. They just got the rook for the knight, which is a good trade. And so they're forcing some more material to come off the board by pinning this bishop and offering the trade. So white takes and black recaptures. All right, white plays the move g3, and this brings us to principle number 8, which is be alert for when your opponent makes weaknesses, okay? Be alert when your opponent creates weaknesses. As soon as g3 is played, there are weaknesses on these light squares that are created because the pawn that was controlling those squares is gone, and pawns do not move backwards. So what does Tarrasch do? Queen to c6. Immediately takes advantage of the weaknesses that are created. This is something that strong players do all the time. It probably feels like they just like attack you and you never had a chance, but really they're just sitting back and they're waiting, and you're just making these mistakes that you don't realize a lot of times, and then they just pounce on them, right? And that's what we see here. It's like, oh, the pawn has moved forward. Great, thank you very much. Let me just slide my queen up and start to attack those weaknesses, okay? And the king does defend, but now you're in a pin, and you're going to notice how this pin comes back to cost white later in the game. So Tarrasch plays rook d8, attacking the pawn, bishop to e3. Queen jumps into a more aggressive square where it's attacking lots of things, controlling more important squares. Rook to d5. Now, rook to d5 is a very nice move. And if you would like to pause, why do you think black played this move? This is a good moment to test yourself. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, hopefully you said it defends the knight, because it does. That's important. You didn't want to just lose a piece. But more importantly, if white just plays some random move like h4, there was this sneaky threat of rook to f5, attacking that pinned knight and threatening to just take it. And if white tries to defend, do you see what the follow-up is? That's correct. Knight takes d4, attacks the queen, attacks the knight. It's a fork. And notice, the knight's pinned, so you can't take it with the knight. And the bishop is actually also pinned. If you try to take, you're losing your queen for free. So white's in trouble, and they're going to lose, the knight either way, okay? So that was kind of the sneaky threat behind rook to d5. It looks like a defensive move, but it was actually both. A defensive and an offensive move at the same time. So white plays the move a4 to attack the knight before black has time to bring the rook over. Knight goes back, bishop here, knight to f5. Now this brings us to principle number 9, which is isolated pawns are always good targets. Okay, they're good targets because they have no pawns on adjacent files that can support them. Okay, that's the definition of an isolated pawn. This is also an isolated pawn. Make very good targets. And what you've noticed is that black has been kind of jumping this knight around, using the rook and the queen, but constantly keeping the pressure on, and white is basically tied up trying to defend that pawn, unless you're just going to give it up for free, right? All right, now in this position, white played bishop e3 just to go back and defend again. But I want to ask you guys, and this is a good moment to work on your tactics. This one is a little bit more advanced, but what would have happened if the queen came down and captured on b7? What would you play here? There's a nice sequence of moves that's good for black. It wins some material. Not that easy to find, but what would you play? All right, if you had a chance to look at that. So the move is knight takes d4. This kind of kicks things off with the very simple threat of taking this knight. Remember, the knight's pinned, so the knight can't move. So you have to defend this if you're white. But if you'll notice, you can't go here to defend because the knight is controlling that square. So the only thing that white could really do would be to go check first and then swing the queen down to c3 to defend like this. However, black has a follow-up move. This is why it was a little bit difficult to see, because you kind of had to see ahead. The move is g5. And basically what you're doing is saying, look, I'm going to attack the bishop first, just defend it here. And once the bishop retreats somewhere, I'm going to push again, attacking the knight, which is pinned. And now there's no way for white to, not lose a piece. Okay, so not easy to see that. But this is why it's important to kind of be constantly scanning all different areas of the board and thinking about all the different options that you have, including throwing some random pawn forward at the right moment, right? That could be what you need to win some material. Okay, so congratulations if you saw that one. That was not an easy one, but I did want to test you there. So back to the game. Bishop to e3 is what was actually played. All right, so let's go ahead through these next couple of moves quickly here before we jump to principle number 10. He trades the knight, gets the free pawn, plays f5. He's kind of trying to bust open where the king is. g5, the queen goes back to pin the knight again. f4, he's unleashing the rook. Maybe you're going to use this pawn at some point. The queen comes down, the king comes up. Queen goes back, e5, and now the move... No, not here, sorry. He takes the pawn. Remember, the knight is pinned, so that's a safe move. Right here, g6 is played. What move do you play as black? Well, I hope you didn't say retreat your king somewhere, and I hope you didn't say take the pawn with your king, okay? Because all of those moves are bad. And this brings us to principle number 10, which is it's never too late to blunder. Despite the fact that black has a totally winning position, if you are not careful, you can throw the entire game away right at this moment, okay? Both of these moves with the retreating the king is going to lead to a back rank checkmate. The only thing you can do is give up the rook, and now it's game over. Same exact thing if you go to g8, okay? You cannot go there, back rank mate. And actually taking the pawn is no good either, because watch this. Queen to b3 attacks here, like the queen's trying to invade. And if you try to go for this fork to win material, watch what happens. Queen takes d3. And then, bam, the knight jumps in with the fork. Okay, so there's a little trap there where if your king was on g6, it suddenly became much more difficult for you. Now, Stockfish has ways that it says you can win, but the idea was that it was not a good square for your king to be on because of this tactic with the knight fork, basically. Okay, so you have to watch out for that. That was kind of white's trick, and so Tarrasch wisely avoids that by simply playing king to h6. He doesn't need the pawn. He just needs to avoid any tricks that white might have, and so he just tucks his king on h6. King goes to h2. Actually, right here, black played the correct move and won the game. But if you would like to pause, what move would you play? Because you can go wrong here if you're not careful. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the trick that you had to watch out for was if you thought rook d3 was the best move. Rook d3, forking these guys would actually run into queen takes e5. And yes, you can grab a knight if you want, but queen g5 is checkmate. Okay, so again, a little trap that you had to avoid. Now, there was other moves you could have played, obviously, in different ways around it, but that's something that you had to watch out for. So the best move was queen to e2 check, invading with the queen, and white actually resigned. The idea is if you come up this way, the queen's going to come into f1 check. I guess you could try to run, but let's see. There's a checkmate after rook d1. There's just too many threats on the white king, and there's nothing that you can really do to stop that. Let's just, for example, you take here, queen h1 is checkmate, and I don't really see what else white can do. The other move, just to show you, if you go back this way, rook to d1 is going to be leading to a quick checkmate. You have to sack your queen, and that's why white resigned. So 10 principles from Tarash. You can apply these to your games. Game number 30 in the Logical Chess series starts on page 217. I'll see you there next time. Don't forget, check out breaking1500.com if you're serious about improving quickly. See you guys next time. As always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.